Welcome back to KTN Prime. Thank you for staying with us. Now, the effects of terrorism are definitely being felt around the region. In fact, just today, another travel advisory for Kenya from the United States. In such a situation, it's tempting to throw everything you have at countering terrorism. But just where do you draw the line? Well, this evening, we speak to Ken Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And you gave a lecture about this, about talking about talking about the place of human rights when you're countering terrorism.
Yes. No, I was at Strathmore Law School today.
Yes.
And Kenya's lived through some horrible terrorist incidents recently. The Westgate Mall, Garissa University, and there have been many smaller situations of terrorism as well. And when a country faces a threat like that, there's a temptation, as you mentioned, to feel that there should be no restraints whatsoever in going after the terrorists.
Right.
We've seen how that plays out. George Bush is an example of that. He ignored the basic restrictions of human rights. He tortured people. He disappeared people. He gave them unfair trials. And it was a disaster. We've now learned from that he got no real actionable intelligence from the torture. But he lowered America's esteem, and most important, he alienated the very communities that were most likely to have evidence of imminent terrorist threats. And so I think, Kenya is fortunate in a sense in that it can learn the lessons of some of the missteps of other governments. If you look at, what was al-Shabaab trying to accomplish when it selected the Muslims to exempt from its murderous spree? It wanted the Kenyan government to respond with a war against Muslims, with a war against ethnic Somalis. Why did it want that? Well, al-Shabaab is strong in Somalia, but it's relatively weak in Kenya, and it needs a base of recruits. It knows that if Kenya alienates Muslims, if it alienates ethnic Somalis with these broad sweeps, it's going to generate exactly the kind of animosity that makes for fertile recruiting grounds.
Right.
So it's very important for Kenya not to play al-Shabaab's game, to vigorously respect human rights, to treat all Kenyans equally, to respect the rights of every citizen, and to ensure that the terrorists themselves are targeted lawfully, arrest them, give them a fair trial, then put them in prison, but not to stoop to their level, because that's exactly what they want in order to build a broader base in Kenya.
It makes it easier for them to recruit, doesn't it?
Precisely.
And you've mentioned some important lessons that we could have learned from mistakes that were made. You mentioned the Bush administration. But have we made some of those mistakes already as Kenya?
Sadly, some of the initial steps were really missteps. And, one can understand in the emotional response to a horrible terrorist attack like Garissa University.
Yes.
There is a tendency to just, say no holds barred. We're going to do everything. But if you look at, some of these sweeps that have taken place, which seem to really collectively punish communities rather than singling out the terrorists, or if you look at the cases of torture, of disappearance, of summary executions that we've seen, this is not the way to go about fighting terrorism. This is the way to play al-Shabaab's game. And in fact, that's what al-Shabaab wants. If they're going to be defeated, the communities who are most likely to know about the next terrorist attack need to know that they can trust the government. I mean, imagine if you see something suspicious down the street. Are you going to report it if you think that person's going to be tortured or summarily executed? Probably not.
Probably not.
Yes.
Probably.
And so it's essential, particularly with the communities who are most likely to know. That is, the ethnic Somali communities, the Muslim communities, to treat them respectfully, to respect their rights, not to stoop to the al-Shabaab level by engaging in torture or summary execution or disappearances.
And as you mentioned that, there certainly are some areas where there's a very strong mistrust. Just as you said, we've had some incidences where communities did feel targeted. So how does Kenya go about repairing that bridge and, allowing their citizens to feel that, they're on their side?
Well, part of it starts at the top with a message from the president that he intends to ensure that he's going to fight terrorism vigorously, but in a way that respects rights. But part of it is also a matter of not cracking down on the NGOs, not trying to silence the media. Because, we've seen criticisms of these missteps, and the government has had very thin skin. And it has now, introduced possible amendments to the PBO Act to try to rein in NGOs. I've spoken to journalists who feel very uncomfortable talking about some of these issues. They're under pressure from the government. That, in a sense, deprives the government of the kind of feedback that it needs to know when it's crossing the line.
But does that feedback not empower the al-Shabaab in some ways and make them maybe look even stronger than they are?
See, that's my point. You empower al-Shabaab by playing their game, by stooping to their level, by committing serious abuses. You empower Kenyans by saying that this is a society that is strong. It respects the rule of law. It respects rights. It allows legitimate criticism by NGOs, by the press, whomever, and it wants, through an engaged public, to be kept to the high standards that need to be maintained if this fight against terrorism is going to work.
Okay, so moving forward, you've mentioned a few things that the government can do, but in terms of the citizens as well, because they're a part of this struggle, what can they do?
Well, obviously, if you see something suspicious, you should report it. I mean, that the way you crack terrorist cells is usually through the neighbors, through the people down the street, through the people who happen to be seeing somebody scouting out a potential terrorist attack site. But the way to gain the confidence of those people is to let them know that, they may be Muslim, they may be ethnic Somali. If they go to the police to report something, they're not going to get arrested. They're not going to get tortured. So it's important to really maintain a high bar in your own conduct. If people cross those lines, if they engage in torture, they've got to be punished. The government has to make clear that it stands for scrupulous respect for basic rights, not only because that's the right thing to do, but also because it's the only way you're going to succeed in combating the al-Shabaab terrorist threat.
And you've seen this across many countries. Have you seen any instances where this has worked, where taking this approach has actually yielded some results?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at what's happening in Nigeria today, under President Goodluck Jonathan, he pursued the George Bush approach. He was highly abusive in attacking Boko Haram. It was a very corrupt approach where the military didn't even have basic weapons because all the money had been siphoned off.
Right.
The Nigerian people said enough of that. This is not working. And they brought in Mr. Buhari, who has articulated a completely different path. He says he's going to fight corruption. He's going to insist that the army operate lawfully in attacking Boko Haram. He dismissed all the abusive generals.
Yes, he did.
And Nigeria today looks more hopeful than it has for now a couple of years, where Boko Haram was making real progress against the abusive approach of President Goodluck Jonathan.
And I guess, like you said, the key is not playing the terrorist game.
That's
and
exactly
giving
right.
them what they want.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion this
Thank you
evening.
for having me.
Great to have you.